Welcome back to the Bio Guys Do the Bio IA. Today we'll be going over the exploration, and some students might find this a little challenging. Mr. Brown, what are some of the difficult parts of the exploration?
Well, honestly, just starting the exploration is quite difficult. I'm not sure where to start. There's a very bulky safety, background, and methodology section, and they all seem pretty daunting to finish. Additionally, I have to conduct my own research and come up with a research question, and I'm just trying to figure out what I can do to make this more manageable and easier to complete.
Well, to start, you are correct that the exploration might seem a little overwhelming at first, so it will be necessary to split it into distinct sections.
Mr. Donham, what should I go first?
The first part of your exploration should be the background. Now, keep in mind the exploration is exploring your research question before you conduct the actual experiment. So the background needs to be what the reader needs to know about your research question before you really dig into investigating.
What specific things do I need to do in the background to score well?
First, you need to discuss relevant background biology.
How do I do that?
Well, if your research question is biology focused, hopefully this is not too difficult. After all, let's say you had a research question that was related to the rate of transpiration in plants. Well, by now, hopefully you've done the unit, so you know some other biological concepts behind it. Just explain different aspects of that research question, explain the science that you've learned in bio class, and if you are kind of lost in what exact science you need to know for this for your research question, you can also consult your peers or your teacher, and also just do a little background research as well.
Yeah. Three sources you'd recommend for background research?
Absolutely. So you will have to probably do some more academic researching to actually find scholarly sources. We have a bunch of sources linked down below. Things like JSTOR, things like the Google Scholar, and there's a full list. If you're doing the extended essay, for example, there's a full list of scholarly sources that you probably have. But also just keep in mind, if you're looking just for like a study that might relate to your research question, sometimes just searching up your research question into Google can find some studies related to it. And also keep in mind, PubMed's a very, very good source. I know when I wrote my bio AA, I used PubMed a lot for studies that supported my background information, so I would recommend going into that stuff as well.
So, Mr. Donham, what's the next step once you have done background research?
Once you've done background research, you essentially just need to put it into your background to actually finalize and explain why you're manipulating your independent and dependent variable and the context behind what the relationship might be. So in your research question, for example, you're investigating citric acid concentration. So I would have a paragraph in the background where you go over why are you manipulating the citric acid concentration? What are some known relationships and effects of citric acid maybe on enzymes? And then kind of explain why you were really manipulating the concentration as well. Make sure you also explain your dependent variable. Your dependent variable, I believe, is rate of germination. So you can explain things about like enzymes, about how the enzymes might be affected by citric acid, and just explain how enzymes and the rate of reaction is related to the rate of germination. You have to make that connection, and once you made that connection, you can attach scientific context to your actual dependent variable that you're measuring in the experiment. And once you've done that, you should be on a great start for the experiment and for the rest of the IA.
All right, is there anything else you need to do in the background section to score 7 on the IA?
Yeah, make sure that you've really consulted all the boxes on the scoring sheet surrounding the background scientific information. Make sure that whenever you mention an organism, you always are using the scientific name. If you find this to be a bother, the first time you should use the scientific name, and then maybe later you can just switch to the common name. But just keep in mind that the scientific name throughout the bio AA is always going to be evaluated as a point. I would also, of course, have a hypothesis section. The hypothesis should be consulting your research question. So if for example, you're investigating the effect of citric acid concentrate on the rate of germination of pea seeds. In this case, I would have a hypothesis predicting the relationship. Citric acid, I believe, is a herbicide, so probably you can predict, well, I believe that the rate of, or you never include I believe in the hypothesis, but it's the rate of, as the rate of citric acid increases, the germination rate should decrease. So you have a hypothesis. You should also have a null and alternative hypothesis in case you've kind of confused on what those are, although hopefully you've done an experiment of using both of these ideas. The null hypothesis is a hypothesis where you're assuming that there's no significance between your dependent and independent variable. Your alternative hypothesis is you're basically saying that there is some significant correlation between both variables. And also, if relevant, I recommend it, although it's not technically required, include a graph that is your predicted relationship between the independent and dependent variable. And And once you've done all that and you've included background information into your hypothesis, you should be on a great start. You should be pretty much done with the background section, a section that many students often struggle with.
Thank you for explaining that to me. I think the background section is also a great spot to sprinkle a little bit of that personal connection to make sure you get the full marks. Let's move on to the methodology section. How do you store the 7 marks in that?
So the methodology section, if you actually look at the scoring sheet, it's very long. It has a ton of boxes, but keep in mind that this section is less daunting than it may initially appear. So what is the methodology section exactly? You're essentially going over the methods you're using to investigate your research question. So of course, you'll probably be conducting a hands-on experiment. If you're doing something database, it might differ a little bit, and I recommend consulting with the teacher if you're doing that. But if you're doing a hands-on experiment, you're gonna have multiple sections in your methodology section. First off, you of course have to create a variable table. I mean, you don't have to, but I do recommend it. This variable table will include your independent variable, your dependent variable, the units for both variables, as well as the uncertainty for these variables as well. And you also need to control your variables. Are you confused about what a controlled variable might be?
A little bit. Can you go into more depth on that?
So a controlled variable is essentially a variable you have to control for your for the validity and reliability of your investigation to be higher. If you don't control certain things, if you're investigating, say, enzymes, for example, if you're not controlling temperature, you might not be really able to confidently use your data because it might be due to something that was extraneous to your research question. So controlled variables basically are things you have to control to make sure your research question is being answered as honestly as it is from the data being measured.
Yeah, I was looking at the score sheet and I noticed that CV was on that quite frequently. Is that just controlled variables?
Yeah, CV does stand for controlled variable, and if you're ever kind of confused on, well, I don't really know controlled variables I need to include, typically things like temperature, volume of solution, amount of water, they're typically pretty intuitive. If you're ever confused, I recommend consulting with a peer or maybe consulting with your teacher to see if you're really missing some important controlled variable. Make sure you're explaining why you're controlling the variables and make sure to include the units for the variables as well.
Yeah. Another idea is to also consult other research and past IAs to see what they're controlling as the variables, because they're probably pretty similar. So once you control variables, what do we do next?
So next up, I recommend having a materials sheet. This, I believe, only has one box on the methodology sheet, but I do recommend it as it is helpful and it kind of allows easy replicability of your research, of your experiment in your bio IA. So in your materials section, you should have the graduation of the instruments used. So like a graduation is how much like milliliters you fit into the cylinder or whatever. There's also, you'll include the amount of materials used and also the uncertainty of the materials. Yeah, you can kind of just put this in the table. Hopefully your teacher has given you a table, like a template table that you can put your materials into. And if you do have that, this should be an easier section. This one's pretty simple. Just make sure you're including all the sections, including the quantity, the graduation of the instruments used, and the quantity used.
Yeah. It's really important to use tables throughout this methodology section, because when someone grades it, it's easy to predict, to add like your uncertainty for each material, and having a table makes that straightforward and easy to remember.
Absolutely.
So once you do the materials, what's the last step in the methodology section?
So keep in mind, you haven't made the procedure yet. The procedure is the step-by-step, really, instructions on how you're conducting your experiment. So there's a couple things to remember. First of all, you should probably have done some background research onto specific methods other researchers have used to investigate their research question. This could be, typically I've seen in bio-IAs, people use like university websites for specific ways to like measure some dependent variable or stuff like that. So it depends on how much of a known research procedure you're adopting. Typically, at a minimum, you should at least have some elements being used from an online or reputable source that has a procedure you're replicating. At a maximum, if you're just directly kind of copying the procedure over, you should at least adapt the little elements to show that you have shown some initiative in manipulating the procedure. Just make sure you have some source that has a procedure that you're using elements of, and make sure to cite that in your procedure as well. And when you're crafting the procedure, it's really kind of up to you on how much you want to adapt certain elements from a known procedure. And it also can be kind of difficult if you're kind of stuck on how to actually craft it step by step. Once again, I recommend consulting with peers. I recommend just kind of using critical thinking and using the science skills you've built up over the years on how to craft a lab. After all, you've done many labs throughout your high school career at this point, so hopefully that should come into play here. And once you've crafted the procedure and you've made specific note in your procedure on how you're keeping track of control variables, of how you're keeping and making sure the dependent and independent variables are measurable, and show how you manipulated and measured them in a very detailed description, then you should be pretty good on this section, and the methodology should be well on its way to being fully completed.
Awesome. I understand the importance of citing the procedure. Is there any specific format that you'd recommend for writing it out?
Typically, I would just go by number. So I have step 1, step 2, and then at the top, before you begin your procedure, I recommend writing out where you adopted the procedure from, and that's where you would cite that known procedure.
Awesome. I was looking at the score sheet, and it just seems like we have the safety section to talk about. How would you do that?
So the safety section, once again, this kind of depends on what research question you're actually investigating. If you're doing a research question that involves real people or animals, you have to make sure that if you're doing with people, you have human consent forms, and make sure you just kind of have stated that you did those, that you have those signed, maybe take a picture of them as well. I would say that does that. If you're not doing that, any investigation involving people or animals, this section's even more simple. You're just going over any safety concerns. Typically, if you're operating with chemicals, you have to talk about, what happens if you get them in your eye, if you touch them. Is there any concerns you have to be knowledgeable of before you actually, investigate them? And also, if you're using glassware, this is just a simple and pretty easy thing you can include in your safety section. It's just state what you do to dispose of them if they're broken, state what you do if you're cut by any broken glassware. Stuff like that kind of helps build up your safety section and makes you seem like you're really cognizant of all aspects that concerns your safety in this experiment. Lastly, I would just say keep it in mind that you have to know how to dispose of the chemicals. I recommend including instructions on how to dispose of certain chemicals in your safety section. And lastly, the only other real box you have to keep knowledgeable of from the score sheet is just be mindful of reasonable consumption of resources. State you never used more than needed in your experiment. And once you've done all that, the safety section should be done, and you should be on your way to a 7 in the exploration.
Awesome.